I remember that night well. The forest around the campsite was suffocatingly silent. My research work was going well until the rumors began. You know how it is. Small talks in the surroundings, stories exchanged in nervous whispers. But there was something different this time. Everyone was talking about the Skinwalker, a legend about something that could transform into any animal and fed on fear. Ridiculous, right? Well, at least that's what I thought at first. I've always been a skeptic. Until the animals started looking at me in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if they were watching, stalking. Their eyes, empty, reflected something I didn't want to admit. I tried to ignore it, attributed everything to exhaustion, the fatigue from the long hours in the field. But one night something changed. I was lying down, trying to distract myself with the constant rustling of leaves outside my tent, when I heard it. The voice whispered, as if it were right next to me, yet distant at the same time. It said my name, Megan. I froze. My heart raced, a feeling of imminent danger. I stepped out of the tent, the cold ground under my bare feet, and I saw it, a shadow, moving too fast for me to focus on. It was as if the air around it trembled, distorting reality. But when I tried to follow it, it disappeared. I should have left at that moment, but something inside me compelled me to stay. It was as if something was calling me, demanding my presence. In the days that followed, the animals acted even stranger. They passed by in silence, their heads turning in a disconcerting way, always watching me, as if they knew something I didn't. I felt them at night, even when I couldn't see them. Something was wrong. Something was surrounding me. On the night everything fell apart, I was camped in a deeper part of the forest, alone. The sound of footsteps around my tent woke me from a restless sleep. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just some random animal, until I heard that whisper again, louder this time. Megan. I stepped out of the tent. The night air was cold, heavy, and my breath echoed. And then I saw him. Alan. My childhood friend who had disappeared years ago. He was there, standing, his eyes lifeless, like the animals, a distorted smile on his face. You forgot me, Megan, he whispered. You left me here. I tried to remember. Something pulsed in my mind, but it was hazy, like an old dream. The memories began to return slowly, like pieces of a long-lost puzzle. I was 10 years old at the time. Alan and I used to explore these very same forests. One day we got lost. I managed to find my way back, but he didn't. I never went back to look for him. Fear consumed me, and I left him behind. Now, he was here. But he wasn't the Alan I knew anymore. He had become something different, something twisted, corrupted. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a second I felt the forest breathing around us. You won't leave me again, he said. And then, the transformation began. I watched Alan's body contort, bones breaking with a nauseating sound, flesh stretching in impossible ways. But he wasn't becoming an animal. It was worse. He was becoming the forest itself. Roots sprouted from beneath him, wrapping around his limbs. As his skin turned into wood, his face vanishing into an expression of pure hatred. I ran, but the forest moved with him, the branches entangling my feet, the trees whispering my name like a chorus of condemnation. I tried to escape, but every step seemed to take me deeper, farther from reality. I was trapped. The memories flooded my mind, regret growing like poison. And then I realized I would never leave. Alan wanted me to stay, to feel what he had felt all those years. And now I understood. It was my turn to be lost, my turn to be forgotten. In the end, I saw him again, this time not as the monstrous creature, but as the boy I left behind. He reached out to me, his gaze empty, and I knew what he wanted. I had to pay for what I had done. The price was my very soul. I never left the forest. And now, those who pass through hear a whisper among the trees. A warning. Or maybe an invitation. I never believed in monsters. In fact, I spent years laughing at those stories people tell to scare each other, to justify the fear they feel when they don't have answers. But now here I am, with the blood of yet another victim on my boots, staring at something I can't explain. And the worst part is that the feeling of being watched, hunted, is growing stronger by the day. My name is Jim. I've been a cop for 15 years. I've seen it all, from petty bar fights to bodies torn apart by rival gangs. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I'm dealing with now. It all started with a body, or rather, what was left of it. The first victim showed up in an isolated area near the mountains. The forensic team said it looked like an animal attack, something fierce, brutal, but there were no tracks, no traces of fur, or any sign pointing to an ordinary predator. Just a trail of death. At first, I refused to believe it was anything other than a wolf or bear attack. But then the other murders happened. 4 bodies in 3 weeks, each one more mangled than the last. The pattern was always the same. Parts ripped off, bones snapped like twigs, eyes bulging in sheer terror. Something was hunting in my town, something no one could understand. Or at least, that's what I thought. Because as the weeks went by and the killings piled up, stories started surfacing. People in the bars talking about the Skinwalker of the mountains, an ancient legend, a being that could transform into any creature, human or animal, and feeds on fear. A creature, they say, that never leaves a trace. I talked to some of the town's elders, folks who'd lived here for decades. One of them, a retired hunter, told me, "It's not an animal, Jim. It's something worse. If you look closely, you might realize you've already seen the monster face to face." And that stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. His words echoed in my head at work, at home, even in my dreams. I started having constant nightmares, always the same scene. I was in the woods, alone, and I could feel something watching me from afar. A dark figure, indistinct, always lurking, but never close enough for me to see clearly. I knew I was becoming paranoid, but who could blame me? The pressure of the investigation, the media, the guilt of not solving these murders, it was all consuming me. Even Belle, my longtime partner, started noticing I was different. She'd tell me to take time off, get away for a while, but I couldn't. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew I was close to figuring it out. Then came the worst one yet. One night, I got a call. Another body. But this time, it was different. The scene was horrific. The victim was almost unrecognizable, as if they'd been torn apart by something not human. But there, amid the blood, I found something that made me freeze. A piece of fabric. Small, almost insignificant. But I knew who it belonged to. It was from Belle's jacket. My mind spiraled. It couldn't be her. She'd been with me at the last crime scene. And besides, Belle was my friend for years. We worked together. She was one of the only people I trusted. I was losing it. But the fear, that primal fear, told me otherwise. So I decided to follow her. I waited until she left the station, late at night, and tailed her down the dark roads leading to the mountains. She stopped at an isolated spot, an old shed deep in the woods. My heart was pounding, and I still refused to believe what was happening until I saw her. She didn't notice me arrive. She stood there in the middle of the room, her back to me, muttering something in a language I didn't understand. Then, she turned around. The look on Belle's face, it wasn't human. Her eyes were empty, as if her soul had been ripped away, and in that moment, I knew. "Jim," she whispered, her voice cold, cutting. "You always knew." My whole body went cold. It was as if the darkness of the room had swallowed any hope I had left. The transformation began before my eyes. Belle, or whatever she was now, twisted her body in an impossible way, her bones cracking, her skin stretching, until she became something monstrous, yet still human. She was what everyone feared. Not a beast, not a wild animal, but something far more sinister, something that walked among us unnoticed. I had to make a decision. My hand shook as I reached for my gun. I didn't want to shoot, not her. But I had no choice. She lunged at me, too fast for me to react, and I felt the searing pain in my chest. The world blurred, and all I remember is collapsing to the ground, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. I woke up in the hospital. I'd been saved, but Belle was gone. No traces, only the sound of her whispering my name that night, like a nightmare that won't end. Now, I look at people in the town and wonder, how many more are like her? How many monsters walk among us, unnoticed? I still hear her whisper sometimes when I'm alone. Evil isn't out there in the shadows, it's right beside us, wearing familiar faces. And that's what truly terrifies me. I've always been a skeptic. A clinical psychologist with 15 years of experience, used to navigating the labyrinths of the human mind, deep traumas, irrational fears. So when I got a call asking for my help with a special patient, I didn't hesitate. After all, I'd handled extreme cases before, people believing all sorts of things. But if I had known what I'd encounter at that clinic, I would have refused. I would have run as far away as possible. My name is Bob, And this is the story of how my life stopped making sense. The first time I met the patient, I felt an involuntary shiver. He was sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes glazed over, fixed on some random point on the wall. His name was Peter, but he refused to answer to it. "I'm no longer Peter," he murmured repeatedly. "I'm something beyond." At first, I thought it was a schizophrenic delusion, an acute dissociative state. He claimed he was a skinwalker, a shape-shifting entity capable of stealing the lives of those it touched. I was used to grandiose delusions, but there was something in Peter's eyes, something dark, that made me hesitate for a moment. In the first few days, the treatments were standard, talking about childhood trauma, prescribing mood stabilizers. But the more I talked with him, the more I felt that something was off. Peter had a way of looking at me that unsettled me deeply, as if he were seeing beyond my skin, something I couldn't even see myself. And things began to get worse. By the second week, I started having strange dreams. Dreams so vivid it was hard to believe they weren't real. I found myself in the bodies of other people, walking through places I'd never been. I could smell the fear of strangers, hear muffled screams, see faces twisted in terror. And when I woke up, the details stayed with me. Cold sweat, my heart racing, the feeling of being watched. These dreams began to eat away at my sanity. I felt myself changing, losing touch with my own thoughts, as if something else was taking control. The other staff at the clinic also started reporting strange occurrences. Voices whispering down empty hallways, lights flickering despite regular maintenance, patients vanishing without a trace. No one spoke openly, but there was a growing sense of fear among us. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew it was connected to Peter. The sessions with him became increasingly disturbing. He would stare at me with that cold smile, telling me things he shouldn't know. He talked about my nightmares, describing every detail of my restless nights with unsettling precision, and I felt myself losing control. "You're changing, Bob," he'd say. "You feel it, don't you? You're becoming like me." I tried to pull away. I asked to be reassigned, even considered taking a leave of absence, but I couldn't. Something kept pulling me back to him, to that dark, cold room. I felt like I had to uncover the truth, had to understand what was happening to me. By the third week, everything fell apart. I got a call from one of the nurses at the clinic. Peter had disappeared. He was just gone. No signs of escape, nothing. The security cameras showed him standing in his room, and then he was no longer there. I was desperate, feeling like I was being pulled into an abyss, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't over. And then he appeared. At my house. It was night, and I was trying to sleep, but the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway jolted me awake. I grabbed a kitchen knife, trembling, not knowing what to expect. But when I opened the door, there he was. Peter, standing in the middle of my living room with that same cold, empty stare. "I told you, Bob. You're changing," he said, his voice low but filled with a power that froze me in place. "Now, it's your turn." I couldn't move. He began to approach me, and my body reacted against my will. It was as if my legs, my arms, were no longer mine. He extended his hand, and in that moment, I knew. He was passing something to me, a curse, a dark essence that pulsed in the air between us. I could feel the change beginning slowly, like a poison spreading through my body. I had to decide. I had to do something. I could kill him right there, end it once and for all, or I could try to save him. I could try to free him from this thing that was consuming him. But at what cost? The moment our eyes met, I realized there was no escape. I made the choice that changed everything. I chose to save Peter, to help free him. But by doing so, something inside me broke. He collapsed to the ground, as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But I felt that dark force wrapping around me, consuming me from within. When it was all over, he was gone, but I remained changed. Now I walk around carrying a part of him inside me. Sometimes I hear whispers at night, echoes of whatever now lives within me. The most disturbing part is that, in moments of distraction, I catch my reflection in the mirror, and for a brief second, my eyes are no longer mine. They're Peter's. I go on with my life, but I know it's only a matter of time. I'm not the same anymore, and maybe very soon I too will disappear. Or worse, maybe I'll turn into something I no longer recognize. Have you ever felt like you're being watched? Like every step you take is followed by invisible eyes, by a presence that surrounds you in a suffocating way, even when you're alone. I felt that for the first time the night I decided to enter that damned forest. My name is Christine. I study anthropology, and if there's one thing that fascinates me, it's how ancient legends and stories survive through time, permeating modern culture in ways we don't even realize. It was that curiosity that brought me here to research native legends. But what I didn't know is that sometimes these legends have much deeper and much darker roots. It all started innocently enough. I was working on a thesis about ancient beliefs and the power of folklore. My colleagues always mocked me, saying I took these stories too seriously. But after hearing about an ancient legend of a Skinwalker, something capable of shape-shifting and inhabiting these forests, my fascination grew. Some people in town mentioned that, many years ago, a young woman had been killed by a mysterious force in that very region. And according to the legend, the curse still lingers, fed by fear and ignorance. Of course, my colleagues laughed when I said I was going to investigate. "It's just a story to scare tourists, Christine," they said. But something told me there was more to it. Something real, something I needed to see with my own eyes. The night I decided to go, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind cut through my skin like invisible razors. I took my camera, a recorder, and a notebook. Everything seemed too quiet at first. The distant sound of owls, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, something changed. First, there was the silence. That absolute silence, where even the sound of the wind seems to be sucked away by the darkness. Then the shadows. It felt like the trees were leaning over me, blocking any light that tried to pierce through. And then the whispers began. "Christine." It was low, almost a murmur, but I knew it was my name. My body froze, every muscle tensing, as if I were on the edge of a cliff. I looked around, my breathing quickening, and saw nothing. Just shadows, long and twisted, dancing between the trees. I convinced myself it was just the wind, that I was hearing things. But the truth was darker. I kept walking. I couldn't stop, even though my entire body screamed for me to turn back. There was something there, a presence pulling me deeper into the forest, like an invisible magnet. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I began to feel the weight of the air growing denser, heavier. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were light, almost imperceptible, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something or someone was following me, keeping just enough distance to stay hidden, but close enough for me to know I was being hunted. I looked back and saw nothing. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like it would burst from my chest. And then, suddenly, the figure appeared. She was there, standing in the middle of the path, so still I didn't know if she was real or just a trick of my mind. The dim light from my flashlight barely revealed her form. It was a woman, or it seemed to be. Her body was distorted, as if caught between two realities. Her face, pale as the moon, was marked by a deep sadness, and her eyes, they weren't human. They gleamed in a way that made my skin crawl. "Have you come to free me?" Her voice was an echo, a lament that seemed to come from a place far, far away. I wanted to run, scream, but something held me back. She continued, slowly moving closer, and I saw that her feet didn't touch the ground. "I am the soul of a young woman, sacrificed to a power I never asked for," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp whisper. "To break the curse, someone must make the sacrifice. You understand that, Christine?" My mind was struggling to process what was happening. Sacrifice? Break a curse? This couldn't be real. And yet, there she was, that shadowy figure asking for something I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to run. Part of me knew I should, but another part, a deep, instinctive part, told me that if I fled, I would never escape. I would be forever trapped in that forest with that voice calling to me, haunting me. "You have to decide," she said, her voice growing fainter. "Either I continue or you free me. But there is a price." What I did next, I still don't know if it was courage or desperation, but somehow I knew that the price would be my own life, my own future. I looked into her eyes, or what was left of them, and nodded. In that moment, the forest around me began to change. The shadows withdrew, and an icy cold ran down my spine. The wind howled with a supernatural force, and I felt my body weaken. as if my very energy was being drained. The last thing I saw was the woman's face dissolving into the mist and her final whisper, "Thank you." And then, the void. I was never seen again. Now, they say the forest is different. Those who dare enter feel the presence of someone still walking there, someone lost while seeking the truth. But my memories, they remain alive, like a dark warning, echoing for those who dare go too deep in search of the unknown. Be careful what you seek, for you may find more than you were prepared to face. I've always been drawn to forgotten places, those remote villages, trapped in time, where the silence seems to hold ancient secrets. My name is Lauren, a photographer, and my work has always been about capturing stories through the lens, stories no one else dares to tell. But this time, I had no idea the story would capture me. That's how I ended up in this village, a hidden place between tall mountains, shrouded in a mist that seemed never to lift. The constant smell of wet earth and decay hung in the air, as if death was embedded in the walls of the dark wooden houses. I was there for a photography project about local legends, and the one that intrigued me the most was the Skinwalker. Something about the idea of people who somehow transform, something that crosses the boundary between human and the unspeakable. At first, everything seemed calm. The villagers were reserved, eyeing my camera with suspicion, as if it were a tool of desecration. "You shouldn't be here," I heard an old woman say one night. "The stories you came to find aren't just stories." I smiled and pretended not to care, but deep down, something about that warning shook me. Just not enough to make me leave. I started exploring the village with my camera. Every click captured something deeper than I expected. The photos looked normal at first glance, but when I reviewed them at night, in the small hotel room where I was staying, something strange appeared. You know when you feel like there's something in the corner of your eye, but when you turn, nothing's there? It was like that, only in the photos. Shadows, distorted figures, and those eyes that gleamed, always watching me from a distance, as if waiting for something. Then the dreams started. I would wake up, drenched in cold sweat, with images of transformation seared into my mind. People screaming, their bodies twisting, skin tearing, and that horrible feeling of helplessness. It was always the same dream, the human figure bending, turning into something monstrous, something that shouldn't exist. And every time, in the background, I could hear the sound of footsteps on wet earth, slowly approaching. One afternoon, I decided to hike up the mountains around the village. They said that up there in those forests, the ritual had taken place. A group of villagers had disappeared years ago, and since then, the few who dared to return were never the same. I needed to see it, I needed to understand, and I needed to capture everything with my camera. The trail was difficult. The mist seemed to grow thicker as I climbed, like the air itself was trying to swallow me. When I finally reached the top, the scene was eerily empty, absolute silence. But when I started taking pictures, the lens captured something my eyes couldn't. There between the trees, a figure. It looked human, but something was wrong, something I couldn't quite define. As I got closer, I realized he was watching me. He didn't run, didn't say anything. He just stared, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, as if he had been waiting for me. Then he spoke, in a voice that sounded like an echo from centuries past. "You want to know about the Skinwalker, don't you?" I trembled, but I didn't back away. I couldn't. My camera was in my hands, ready, as if it were my only defense. He approached slowly, and the air around me seemed to close in as if I was trapped in a nightmare. "I was one of them, before the ritual," he said with a calmness that made my skin crawl. "One of us had to carry the burden, the weight of the transformation. The curse is still here, trapped in this place. You feel it, don't you? The call, the weight." Fear gripped my chest. I knew I was standing before something that shouldn't exist, something far bigger than any legend I had ever heard. And he continued, "You can set me free, but there's a price. I need you to capture the essence of my existence so I can leave this place. But in doing so, you will carry the weight." He was asking me to take a picture. Simple, right? Just press the button. But I knew that in doing so, something much deeper would happen. Something I wasn't ready to face. He stepped even closer. I could feel his heavy breath. The smell of damp earth mixed with something rotten, something that came from inside him. "Come on, Lauren. Take the picture. Finish what they started. My hands were shaking. I knew that if I took that picture, there would be no turning back. I would become part of the curse, part of the story I was so eager to capture. But something inside me, a force I didn't understand, made me lift the camera. I looked through the lens and there he was. No longer human, no longer a person. An ancient, broken, and cursed being. Click. The sound of the shutter echoed through the forest, and in a second, everything changed. The mist seemed to be sucked away and the man, or what was left of him, disappeared. But the air, the weight, the terror, it remained, and I knew something was different about me. I walked down the mountain in silence, trying to process what had just happened, but with every step I could feel his presence with me. Something had been passed to me. And then I remembered what he said before disappearing. The curse will still remain in the village. I left that village the next day. I went back to the city, stored the photos on a drive I've never opened again. But the eyes, those gleaming eyes in the shadows, they still haunt me. When I'm alone, I feel like I'm being watched. When night falls, I hear the sound of footsteps on wet earth, coming from somewhere I can't see.